May 22, 1943, 30 degrees north latitude, 42 degrees west longitude, mid-Atlantic. Lieutenant Commander William Drain, commanding officer of Composite Squadron 9, banked his Grumman TBF Avenger hard to starboard, his eyes locked on the dark shape cutting through the grey water below. The German submarine U-569 had just begun its crash dive, spray erupting from her ballast tanks as compressed air screamed into the diving chambers. Drain had 90 seconds, maybe less, before his target vanished into the depths. The Avenger dropped from 600 feet to 300, Drain calculating the precise release point. Too early, and the depth charges would miss. Too late, and his aircraft would be caught in the blast. His radio man called out ranges while his turret gunner kept his weapon trained on the submarine's deck gun crew, who were desperately trying to man their weapon. 2 depth charges tumbled from his Avenger's bomb bay. The weapons entered the water 15 feet behind the submarine's conning tower. 4 seconds later, twin geysers of white water erupted skyward as 450 pounds of Torpex, explosive, detonated at 100 feet depth. The U-boat shuddered violently, her stern lifted partially out of the water as the shock wave ruptured internal compartments. Oil began spreading across the surface in an ever-widening slick. Drain circled overhead, watching German sailors scramble from the conning tower hatch. The submarine was doomed. Her pressure hull had been compromised. She could not dive again. Her commander made the only decision possible: abandon ship. Minutes later, 47 German submariners floated in their life vests, watching their vessel settle stern first into 3,000 feet of water. Canadian destroyer HMCS St. Laurent moved in to rescue the survivors. 25 men were pulled from the Atlantic. 21 had died in the attack or gone down with their boat. The kill marked a turning point that few in the United States Navy had predicted. The aircraft that delivered this attack had flown from USS Bogue, an escort carrier that Navy leadership had called Impractical just 3 years earlier. A ship that admirals had dismissed as too slow, too vulnerable, too small to matter in modern naval warfare. Yet this ungainly vessel, converted from a merchant hull in less than 8 months, had just demonstrated a capability that would transform the Battle of the Atlantic. In the preceding months, German U-boats had been achieving unprecedented success. During the first 20 days of March 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz's submarines had sunk 82 merchant ships, totaling 476,000 tons. The convoy battles around HX-229 and SC-122 had destroyed 22 ships in just 4 days. British Admiralty reports concluded that Germany had never come closer to severing the Atlantic lifeline between the Pyng, North America, and Britain. By May 1943, German U-boats had reached the peak of their power. 116 submarines prowled the Atlantic shipping lanes. Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, had assembled wolf packs of unprecedented size. The numbers told a story of impending catastrophe. U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than shipyards could replace them. The mid-Atlantic gap, that vast stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft, had become a killing ground. Convoys sailing through this area did so without air cover for 700 miles. U-boat commanders called it the Black Pit. Here, submarines could surface, recharge batteries, and attack convoys with near impunity. Into this crisis sailed a weapon that Navy brass had fought against building. The escort carrier program had begun in December 1940, against the explicit opposition of the Chief of Naval Operations. Admiral Harold Stark and Navy Secretary Frank Knox had killed the initial proposal, arguing that technological advances had made such vessels obsolete before they were even built. Knox had written to the Maritime Commission that a converted merchant vessel can no longer make as satisfactory an aircraft carrier. Small carriers, they insisted, would be death traps, too slow to escape enemy warships, too lightly armed to defend themselves, too small to carry enough aircraft to be useful. The admirals had logic on their side. Modern carrier doctrine emphasized speed and striking power. Fleet carriers could launch massive airstrikes. then steam away at 30 knots before enemy surface forces could engage. They carried enough fighters to defend themselves against air attack. They had armor to survive bomb hits. Escort carriers would have none of these advantages. They would lumber along at barely 16 knots. They would carry perhaps 24 aircraft. They would have no armor protection. Any enemy cruiser could overtake and destroy them. President Franklin Roosevelt had overruled them. On December 21, 1940, he sent a memo through Captain Daniel Callahan ordering an emergency program to convert merchant ships into carriers for anti-submarine warfare. The president grasped what the professional naval officers could not see. The Battle of the Atlantic was not being fought by fleet carriers against enemy fleets. It was being fought by submarines against merchantmen. The threat came from below the surface, not from enemy warships or aircraft. What was needed was not striking power but presence, not speed but persistence, not massive air wings but continuous coverage. A small carrier moving at 16 knots with 24 aircraft could patrol an area for weeks. A fleet carrier moving at 30 knots with 90 aircraft would burn through fuel stocks in days. The mathematics favored slow, small, cheap carriers built in quantity over fast, large, expensive carriers built in limited numbers. The first result was USS Long Island, commissioned on June 2, 1941. Built on a cargo ship hull, she displaced 7,800 tons, measured 495 feet in length, and could barely make 16 knots. Her flight deck was a wooden platform bolted onto the merchant ship structure. Her armor was non-existent. Her aircraft capacity was limited to 21 planes. Navy aviators called her a joke. The press dubbed vessels like her baby Flattops. Crews invented their own nickname for the CVE designation, claiming it stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. Everything about these ships violated the Navy's carrier doctrine developed over 2 decades. Fleet carriers like Enterprise displaced 19,800 tons, made 32 knots, and carried 90 aircraft. They were the queens of the Pacific, armored, fast, powerful. The escort carriers were merchant ships with flight decks, yet the Atlantic battle was not being fought by fleet carriers. It was being lost in the mid-ocean gap where convoys had no air support. Land-based aircraft from Newfoundland could cover the western approaches. British planes from Northern Ireland protected the eastern approaches, but in between lay 700 miles of empty ocean. U-boats owned this space. The first escort carriers to reach the Atlantic were British vessels operating under Royal Navy command. HMS Audacity, converted from a German prize ship, began operations in September 1941. Her aircraft drove off Focke-Wulf Condor bombers that had been shadowing convoys and calling in U-boats. In December 1941, Audacity's fighters shot down 2 Condors and forced 3 U-boats to break off attacks. Then U-751 torpedoed and sank her. The Royal Navy had proven the concept worked. They had also demonstrated the terrible vulnerability that made American admirals hesitate. The United States Maritime Commission had contracted with Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding to build C-3 type cargo ships for the merchant marine. These vessels, designed for commercial service, used steam turbines that could drive them at 19 knots, faster than the diesel-powered merchantmen that had been converted earlier. When the Navy requisitioned 20 hulls for carrier conversion, the Seattle-Tacoma yard had the advantage of modifying ships before completion rather than converting finished vessels. The modifications were extensive but pragmatic. Workers cut away the cargo holds and upper deck, then built a hangar deck inside the hull. 2 elevators connected the hangar to a 442-foot flight deck, a single hydraulic catapult-assisted aircraft launches. A small island structure, built out over the starboard side to keep the flight deck clear, housed the bridge and flight control. The ships retained their merchant marine profile below the flight deck, with vertical sides and a flat bottom that rolled viciously back in heavy seas. Armament was purely defensive. 2 5-inch guns, 1 forward, 1 aft. 8 twin-mounted 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns. 27 20mm Oerlikon cannons. This weaponry could defend against aircraft, but would be useless against any surface warship. Speed remained the ship's primary defense, and at 18 knots, they had precious little of that. The lead ship of the class, USS Bogue, was commissioned on September 26, 1942. Captain Giles Short took command of a vessel with a standard displacement of 8,390 tons and 13,980 tons fully loaded. Her crew of 890 men included aviators from Composite Squadron 9, flying 12 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters and 9 Grumman TB-F Avenger torpedo bombers. After shakedown operations revealed numerous mechanical problems, Bogue entered the yard for 2 months of repairs. When she finally sailed for the Atlantic in February 1943, U-boat attacks had reached catastrophic levels. The Navy's operational plan for escort carriers called for them to accompany convoys, providing continuous air coverage through the mid-Atlantic gap. Bogue made her first 3 crossings in March and April 1943 using this doctrine. Her aircraft flew search patterns ahead of convoys, looking for surfaced submarines. When they found U-boats, the submarines simply dove. The escorts lacked weapons capable of attacking submerged targets effectively. The U-boats waited for the convoy to pass, then surfaced and attacked from behind. In 3 crossings, Bogue's aircraft did not sink a single submarine. Navy critics pointed to this as proof the escort carriers were failures. Too slow to chase U-boats, too small to carry enough aircraft for effective searches, too vulnerable to risk in offensive operations. The Bureau of Aeronautics prepared a report recommending the escort carrier program be terminated after existing contracts were completed. Then Admiral Ernest King changed the doctrine. As Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, King had been watching the British develop hunter-killer tactics. Instead of tying escort carriers to convoy defense, the British were experimenting with independent groups that hunted U-boats in areas where intelligence indicated submarine activity. In May 1943, King ordered American escort carriers to form hunter-killer groups that would operate independently from convoys. Bogue became the nucleus of the first American hunter-killer group. Accompanied by 4 destroyers, she departed Norfolk on April 22, 1943, with orders to seek out and destroy German submarines in the Central Atlantic. Her commander, Captain Short, had complete freedom to pursue any U-boat contact. Intelligence from HF/DF, high-frequency direction finding equipment, and from decoded Enigma messages would guide the group to areas of submarine concentration. The transformation from defensive convoy escort to offensive hunter began immediately. On May 21st, while escorting convoy ON-184, Bogue's HF/DF operators detected radio transmissions from multiple U-boats. Wolfpack Mosul, consisting of 21 submarines, was gathering to attack the convoy. Lieutenant Commander Drain launched 5 Avengers to hunt the transmitting submarines. The aircraft caught U-231 on the surface, recharging batteries. Depth charges damaged the submarine's radio transmitters, forcing her to abort patrol and return to France. The next day brought the breakthrough that validated the entire escort carrier concept. Multiple Bogue aircraft executed 5 separate attacks on different submarines throughout the day. U-305 suffered moderate damage. U-569 took catastrophic hits that forced her crew to scuttle. This marked the first U-boat sunk by United States Navy escort carrier aircraft. More importantly, it demonstrated that hunter-killer groups could disrupt Wolfpack operations before they reached convoys. After delivering convoy ON-184 safely to Argentia on May 26, Bogue received new orders. No more convoy escort, pure hunter-killer operations. Intelligence would direct her group to submarine concentration areas. Her aircraft would saturate those areas with search patterns. Any U-boat found would be attacked with depth charges, later with homing torpedoes. The hunter-killer offensive had begun. On June 5, 1943, Bogue's aircraft found U-217 refueling from a submarine tanker in mid-Atlantic. The Avengers caught both submarines on the surface. Their depth charges sent U-217 to the bottom with all hands. A week later, on June 12th, aircraft from Composite Squadron 9 located U-118 attempting to charge batteries. The submarine crash dived, but slowly. Depth charges ruptured her pressure hull at 150 feet depth. She sank with 49 crew members. July 23rd brought 2 kills in a single day. Bogue's aircraft spotted U-527 on the surface for her daily battery charge. Rockets and depth charges left her crippled and sinking. 12 survivors were rescued by destroyer Clemson and transferred to Bogue as prisoners. On the same patrol, destroyer George E. Badger, part of Bogue's screen, gained sonar contact on U-613. Depth charges destroyed the submarine before she could launch the mines she was carrying to American coastal waters. The pattern continued through the summer and fall of 1943. Bogue's 8th patrol, from November to December, became her most successful. On December 13th, U-172 was located through HF/DF intercepts. Aircraft from Bogue coordinated with 4 destroyers in a 27-hour running battle. The submarine twisted and turned, dove and surfaced, but could not escape. She finally went down with 13 crew killed and 46 captured. December 20th completed the patrol with the sinking of U-850. In 6 weeks, this single escort carrier group had eliminated 3 German submarines. By the end of 1943, Bogue and her escorts had sunk 11 German U-boats plus 2 Japanese submarines. No convoy lost a ship while under Bogue's protection. Not a single aircraft from Composite Squadron 9 was shot down by enemy action during the entire war. Her task group received a Presidential Unit Citation for 6 of her 8 patrols, making her the most successful anti-submarine warfare carrier of World War II. The success was not limited to one ship. USS Card, sister ship to Bogue, began hunter-killer operations in August 1943. Her aircraft and escorts would sink 11 U-boats during the war. USS Core accounted for 7 kills. USS Block Island destroyed 7 before being torpedoed and sunk by U-549 on May 29, 1944. She was the only American escort carrier lost to submarine attack in the Atlantic. The transformation of the Battle of the Atlantic could be measured in brutal statistics. In March 1943, U-boats had sunk 82 ships, totaling 476,000 tons in the Atlantic alone. In April, losses remained heavy with 39 ships and 235,000 tons. Then came May, the month that would be remembered as Black May by German submariners. 41 U-boats were sunk in May 1943. The carnage was unprecedented in submarine warfare. 18 went down in convoy battles, overwhelmed by improved escort tactics and new weapons. 14 fell to air patrols equipped with centimetric radar that could detect surfaced submarines in darkness or fog. The remainder were lost to mines, accidents, and hunter-killer groups like Bogue's Task Force. Among those destroyed were 5 crucial U-tankers, the submarine supply vessels that allowed German U-boats to operate far from their bases. These Type 14 U-boats, nicknamed milk cows by their crews, carried 700 tons of fuel oil, 4 torpedoes, and provisions for extended patrols. Each tanker could refuel a dozen attack submarines, extending their operational range by thousands of miles. Without these tankers, operational range collapsed. Submarines could no longer reach the distant hunting grounds in the central Atlantic and Caribbean, where convoys were vulnerable. They were forced to operate closer to European waters where Allied defences were strongest. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was devastating. Submarines that had routinely achieved multiple kills per patrol were now struggling to survive. Boats that surfaced to recharge batteries at night found themselves illuminated by radar-equipped aircraft within minutes. Wolf packs that gathered to overwhelm convoy escorts discovered that escort carriers could vector destroyers onto them before they could coordinate attacks. The hunters were becoming the hunted. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Donitz sent an encrypted message to all U-boats. The losses are too heavy. All boats are to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. Return to base areas. The wolf packs had been defeated. After 3 years and 8 months of nearly continuous success, the German submarine offensive had been broken in 3 weeks. The U-boat withdrawal marked the turning point in the Atlantic battle, but not its end. Dönitz refused to accept defeat. He committed German engineering and industrial resources to developing new submarine types that could operate submerged for extended periods. The Type 21 U-boat, with improved batteries and streamlined hull, could make 17 knots underwater, faster than most Allied escort ships. If deployed in sufficient numbers, these revolutionary submarines might regain the advantage. Meanwhile, escort carrier construction accelerated. Henry Kaiser's shipyards at Vancouver, Washington, began producing Casablanca-class carriers at an extraordinary rate. Kaiser, an industrialist with no shipbuilding experience before the war, had revolutionized ship construction by applying mass production techniques from automobile manufacturing and construction engineering. These purpose-built escort carriers, constructed from the keel up rather than converted from merchant hulls, incorporated lessons learned from earlier classes. Kaiser's yards used prefabricated sections built in enormous assembly buildings. Workers welded together hull sections, deckhouse modules, and machinery spaces inland, then transported the completed assemblies to the building ways. This modular construction dramatically reduced build times. The first Casablanca-class carriers required 8 months from keel laying to commissioning. By RET2, the middle of the production run, Kaiser's workers had reduced this to 3.5 months. Welding crews worked 3 shifts around the clock. Women, many with no prior industrial experience, operated welding equipment alongside experienced shipwrights. The yards employed orchestrated construction sequences where multiple teams worked simultaneously on different sections of each ship. 50 Casablanca-class ships were ordered on June 18, 1942. The first, USS Casablanca herself, was commissioned on July 8, 1943. The 50th ship, USS Munda, was completed exactly 1 year later on July 8, 1944. This represented an average commissioning rate of 1 carrier every 7.3 days. At peak efficiency, Kaiser's yards were launching completed escort carriers faster than some shipyards could build destroyers. The ships emerged with improved stability, better aviation facilities, and more reliable machinery than the converted merchantmen. Each carrier displaced 7,800 tons, made 19 knots, and operated 28 aircraft. While still slow and vulnerable by fleet carrier standards, they proved perfectly adequate for anti-submarine work. The hunter-killer offensive continued with increased intensity through 1944. The tactics that made escort carrier groups so deadly evolved through combat experience. Aircraft from Composite Squadron 9 and other carrier air groups perfected the coordination between visual search, radar detection, and attack procedures. The Grumman TB-F Avenger proved ideal for anti-submarine warfare. The aircraft could carry depth charges, acoustic homing torpedoes, or rockets depending on the tactical situation. Its long range allowed extended patrols far from the carrier. Its robust construction let it operate in weather that grounded lighter aircraft. The Avenger's 3-man crew provided redundancy, with pilot, radio man, and turret gunner, each trained to take over if one was incapacitated. Depth charges remained the primary weapon through 1943. Mark 44 acoustic homing torpedoes, introduced in early 1944, revolutionized anti-submarine warfare. These weapons, nicknamed Fido by their operators, could home on the sound of a submarine's propellers. Once dropped near a diving U-boat, the torpedo would circle until it detected engine noise, then track the submarine automatically. U-boat commanders discovered that their previous tactic of crash diving no longer guaranteed escape. The noise of their diving procedures attracted the very weapons they were trying to evade. Escort carrier groups developed elaborate search patterns that covered vast ocean areas. Aircraft flew sector searches, each plane assigned a specific area to patrol. When one aircraft detected a submarine, The carrier vectored additional aircraft to the contact while destroyers raced to the location. The submarine found itself facing attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. Surface ships forced the boat to stay submerged while aircraft waited overhead for any attempt to surface. This coordinated pressure could continue for hours or days until the submarine's batteries died or its crew surrendered. In October 1944, Admiral Francis Lowe, Chief of Staff of the 10th Fleet, wrote in a memo to Admiral King that escort carrier support groups accounted for approximately 60% of all U-boats sunk by United States forces in the Atlantic and Mediterranean during the 6 months from April through September. This extraordinary success ratio demonstrated how completely these converted merchantmen had transformed naval aviation doctrine. The hunter-killer groups had become more effective than land-based patrol aircraft, despite operating from ships that Navy leadership had initially rejected. Beyond their combat success, escort carriers proved their worth in ways the CT early skeptics had never imagined. They served as aircraft ferries, carrying planes from American factories to combat zones. USS Bogue made several trips to Glasgow, Scotland, transporting Army Air Force fighters. These missions freed fleet carriers for combat operations in the Pacific. Escort carriers provided air cover for amphibious landings. Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in November 1942, employed 4 escort carriers among its support forces. Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France in August 1944, used 2 escort carriers to provide close air support. The slow-converted merchantmen could loiter near invasion beaches, their aircraft on call for immediate support missions that faster fleet carriers could not provide. They served as training platforms for replacement pilots transitioning to carrier operations. USS Charger spent the entire war operating off the East Coast, qualifying thousands of naval aviators in carrier landings before they deployed to combat zones. This training role prevented fleet carriers from being diverted from combat operations for pilot qualification. Most critically, escort carriers vindicated President Roosevelt's strategic vision. The president had grasped that winning the Atlantic battle required closing the air gap. Land-based aircraft could not reach mid-ocean. Fleet carriers were too valuable and too few to tie down on convoy escort. Escort carriers offered the only solution, cheap enough to build in quantity, capable enough to operate aircraft effectively, available in sufficient numbers to provide continuous coverage. The numbers told the story of American industrial response to crisis. Of the 151 aircraft carriers built by the United States during World War II, 122 were escort carriers. Approximately 80 were commissioned in the United States Navy during wartime. Another 38 were delivered to Britain under Lend-Lease. Production peaked in 1944 when American yards completed 47 escort carriers. This avalanche of hulls overwhelmed the U-boat threat through sheer numbers. By the end of 1944, only 6 American escort carriers remained assigned to Atlantic anti-submarine operations. The others had been sent to the Pacific, where they would prove equally valuable in a completely different role. The Atlantic had been won, the hunters had become prey, the cost had been significant. 6 American escort carriers were lost to enemy action during the war. USS Liscombe Bay was torpedoed by Japanese submarine 1175 off the Gilbert Islands on November 24, 1943. The torpedo detonated the ship's bomb magazine. She sank in 23 minutes with the loss of 644 men. USS Block Island went down to U-549 in the Atlantic. 4 more escort carriers would be sunk in the Pacific theater, but measured as against their impact, the cost was acceptable. By war's end, 11 American Atlantic escort carrier task groups had sunk 53 German submarines. This included the most remarkable achievement in anti-submarine warfare during World War II, the capture of U-505 intact on June 4, 1944. Captain Daniel Gallery, commanding officer of escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, had been planning this operation for months. His task group had practiced boarding procedures repeatedly. When destroyers detected U-505 submerged approximately 150 miles off Spanish Sahara, Gallery ordered a relentless depth charge attack. The submarine, unable to escape and running out of battery power, surfaced after 8 hours of pursuit. As U-505 broke surface, her crew began abandoning ship. They assumed the Americans would sink their boat with gunfire, standard procedure in submarine warfare. But Gallery had ordered his ships to hold fire. As the German crew swam away from their submarine, a boarding party led by Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David transferred from destroyer USS Pillsbury in a whaleboat. David and 8 men climbed aboard the abandoned submarine, expecting demolition charges to detonate at any moment. They found the boat intact. Scuttling charges had been set but had not yet fired. The boarding party disabled the charges, closed valves to stop flooding, and secured the submarine. It was the first enemy vessel captured at sea by the United States Navy since the War of 1812. U-505 yielded intelligence treasures. Her Enigma machine and codebooks provided cryptographers with insights into German naval communications. Her acoustic torpedoes gave Allied scientists examples of weapons they had only encountered in combat. Her charts revealed U-boat patrol routes and operational procedures. The capture remained classified throughout the war to prevent Germans from changing their codes and procedures. U-505 is now permanently displayed at Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry as a National Historic Landmark. Total U-boat losses to escort carrier groups represented a fraction of the 785 German submarines lost during the war, but the impact far exceeded the raw numbers. Escort carrier groups forced U-boats to remain submerged for extended periods, limiting their effectiveness. They prevented submarine concentration in wolf packs. They protected the convoys that carried 15 million tons of supplies to Britain during the critical period from May 1943 through June 1944. Perhaps most significantly, escort carriers destroyed the mythology that had surrounded submarine warfare since World War I. The idea that submarines were virtually undetectable, that they could strike with impunity from beneath the waves, that no defense existed against underwater attack had dominated naval thinking for decades. Escort carriers proved that continuous air coverage could locate, track, and destroy submarines. They demonstrated that merchant hulls and commercial construction techniques could produce combat-effective warships in months rather than years. The transformation of naval doctrine proceeded rapidly. By late 1944, the Navy had integrated escort carriers into all aspects of naval operations. They served with fleet carrier task forces as replenishment ships, ferrying replacement aircraft to combat carriers. They provided anti-submarine screens for battleship groups and cruiser task forces. They accompanied amphibious assault forces, offering close air support that fleet carriers could not provide while remaining far enough offshore to avoid coastal defenses. In the Pacific, escort carriers became essential to the island-hopping campaign. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, 6 escort carriers of Taffy III encountered the Japanese center force, 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers closing to attack the invasion beaches. The engagement began at 06:48 hours when lookouts aboard USS Fanshawe Bay spotted pagoda masts on the horizon. Within minutes, 18-inch shells from battleship Yamato began falling around the escort carriers. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy III, faced an impossible situation. His 6 escort carriers and 7 escorts were outgunned, outranged, and vastly slower than the approaching Japanese force. The nearest American fleet carriers were over 100 miles away. The invasion beaches, packed with vulnerable transports and landing craft, lay directly behind his formation. If the Japanese broke through, thousands of American soldiers would be slaughtered. Sprague ordered his carriers to launch every aircraft they had, regardless of armament. Torpedo bombers carried depth charges intended for submarine hunting. Fighters were armed with machine guns and small bombs meant for ground support. Some aircraft launched with no weapons at all, making dry runs to distract Japanese gunners. The escort carriers turned east, into the wind for flight operations, and ran at maximum speed toward a rain squall that might provide temporary concealment. For 2.5 hours, the converted merchantmen dodged shells from battleship main batteries while their aircraft attacked the vastly superior Japanese force. Destroyers and destroyer escorts charged the Japanese line, launching torpedoes and firing their 5-inch guns at battleships and cruisers. The escorts were annihilated one by one, but their sacrifice bought time. Japanese Admiral Takeo Kurita, confused by the ferocity of the defense and convinced by radio intercepts that he faced fleet carriers, broke off his attack and withdrew at 09:25 hours. The cost had been severe. USS Gambier Bay was hit repeatedly by Japanese cruisers. Shells tore through her unarmored hull. She lost power, listed, capsized, and sank with 147 crew members. USS St. Lo survived the surface action only to be hit at 10:51 hours by the first organized kamikaze attack of the war. A Mitsubishi Zero, possibly piloted by Lieutenant Yukio Seki, crashed through her flight deck and detonated in the hangar among fueled and armed aircraft. Secondary explosions tore the ship apart. She sank 30 minutes later with 113 killed. Yet the remaining 4 escort carriers of Taffy 3 escaped. The Battle off Samar demonstrated both the terrible vulnerability of escort carriers and their unexpected resilience. These ships, designed for submarine hunting and convoy escort, had stood toe-to-toe with battleships and survived. Their sacrifice saved the later invasion force from annihilation. Naval historians would call it the most gallant action in United States Navy history. Post-war analysis revealed the full scope of escort carrier impact. Research conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that escort carriers had been instrumental in defeating the U-boat offensive. Without continuous air coverage in the mid-Atlantic gap, convoy losses would have remained unsustainable. Britain might have been forced to reduce imports below survival levels. The build-up for D-Day, which required transporting millions of tons of supplies across the Atlantic, could have been delayed or cancelled. Every division that landed in Normandy had crossed the ocean under the protection of escort carrier groups. German naval records captured after the war showed that Admiral Dönitz had considered the escort carrier threat existential to U-boat operations. In his memoirs, Dönitz wrote that the appearance of American escort carriers in the spring of 1943 had forced a complete reconsideration of submarine tactics. Surfacing became impossible in areas where carrier groups operated. Battery charging had to be done at Prosins at night under constant aircraft threat. Transit times increased dramatically as U-boats crept submerged through carrier patrol areas, burning precious battery power to avoid detection. The psychological toll on U-boat crews was severe. Submarines that had once surfaced freely to run on diesel engines were now confined underwater for days at a time. Crews suffered from carbon dioxide poisoning as air quality deteriorated. Battery cells failed from overuse. Navigation became guesswork when submarines could not surface to take star sights. Morale collapsed as boats returned from patrols without sinking a single ship. By late 1943, veteran U-boat commanders were requesting transfer to surface ships. New crews required extensive psychological conditioning before their first patrol. Dönitz had pinned his hopes on Type 21 submarines that could outrun aircraft while submerged. These revolutionary boats, with streamlined hulls and massive battery banks, represented a technological leap forward. They could make 17 knots underwater, faster than most escort ships and fast enough to outrun depth charges. They could remain submerged for extended periods, eliminating the vulnerability that escort carriers exploited. But these revolutionary boats entered service too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. Production delays and bombing of construction yards limited completed hulls to 118 by war's end. Only 4 Type 21s made operational patrols before Germany surrendered. None encountered American escort carriers in combat. For the crews who served aboard escort carriers, the war was an experience of extreme contrasts. Living conditions were cramped beyond anything fleet carrier sailors knew. the converted merchant ships lacked the amenities designed into purpose-built warships. Ventilation was inadequate in tropical waters and freezing in North Atlantic storms. Berthing spaces were crowded with bunks, stacked 3 high. The ships rolled viciously in Atlantic storms, their flat bottoms and high topsides creating maximum leverage for ocean swells. Sailors joked that escort carriers would roll on wet grass. The flight deck crews worked under conditions that would have been considered impossible on fleet carriers. They serviced aircraft in weather that fleet carriers would have suspended operations. They launched and recovered planes in seas that tossed the small carriers like corks. They armed torpedoes and depth charges while standing on decks pitching 30 degrees. Everything was harder, colder, wetter, and more dangerous than on the big carriers. The pilots faced unique challenges. The short flight decks left no margin for error on landing. An Avenger had to catch one of 8 arresting wires stretched across a 442-foot deck while landing on a ship that might be rolling 15 degrees. Miss all the wires and crash barriers offered the only chance to avoid 2AD, going over the bow into the ocean. Yet Composite Squadron 9 pilots made thousands of landings without losing a single aircraft to enemy action. Yet the men who flew from escort carrier decks developed intense pride in their vessels. They knew their ships were underpowered, underarmed, and underprotected. They called them Kaiser coffins and jeep carriers. They referred to the CVE designation as combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. But they also knew their ships had changed the course of the war. A pilot from Composite Squadron 9, interviewed decades later, said simply, "We flew from a merchant ship with a flight deck nailed on top. We sank submarines that were supposed to be sinking us. The brass said we couldn't do it. We did it anyway." The story of escort carriers vindicated not just a type of ship, but a philosophy of industrial warfare. American shipyards had produced these carriers using assembly line techniques adapted from automobile manufacturing. Henry Kaiser had never built a ship before the war. His experience came from constructing dams and highways. He approached shipbuilding as an engineering problem, not a craft tradition. Workers who had never held a welding torch in 1940 were building aircraft carriers by 1943. Prefabricated sections built inland were transported to shipyards and welded together. Women workers, many with no prior shipbuilding experience, operated cranes and welding equipment. Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda, but reality on Kaiser's assembly lines. Ships that would have required 2 years to build in peacetime using traditional methods were completed in 8 months using modular construction. By war's end, construction times had dropped to 3.5 months. This approach violated traditional naval architecture principles that emphasized custom construction and meticulous hand craftsmanship. Naval constructors trained at Annapolis and the Naval War College viewed each ship as a unique creation built to exacting specifications by skilled artisans. Kaiser's approach treated ships as manufactured products, stamped out like automobiles with interchangeable parts and standardized procedures. The naval establishment considered this industrial barbarism. Yet they proved combat effective. Their weapons worked, their aircraft flew, their crews fought and won. The ships that Navy architects called floating death traps survived combat with battleships. The carriers that Bureau of Aeronautics wanted to cancel sank 53 U-boats. The vessels that admirals dismissed closed the mid-Atlantic gap and won the Battle of the Atlantic. Roosevelt's judgment had been vindicated. The president with no naval experience had grasped modern warfare better than admirals with decades of service. The final accounting showed approximately 80 escort carriers commissioned in the United States Navy during World War II. Of these, only 6 were lost to enemy action, a loss rate of 6.7%. This compared favorably to the 13% loss rate for fleet and light carriers. The converted merchantmen had proven as survivable as their larger cousins despite carrying no armor and mounting minimal defensive armament. Their combat record was equally impressive. Escort carrier groups sank 53 German submarines and over 30 Japanese submarines. They shot down hundreds of enemy aircraft. They supported amphibious landings from North Africa to Okinawa. They ferried thousands of replacement aircraft to combat zones. They trained tens of thousands of naval aviators in carrier operations. More than raw statistics, escort carriers changed how naval wars were fought. They demonstrated that numbers could overwhelm quality, that adequate ships in quantity beat superior ships in limited numbers. They proved that industrial capacity was itself a form of military power. They showed that unconventional solutions to tactical problems could succeed when orthodox approaches failed. The admirals who had opposed escort carriers in 1940 never publicly acknowledged their error. But the Navy's post-war planning incorporated escort carriers as essential fleet units. The Commencement Bay class, 40 ships ordered beginning in 1943, were purpose-designed escort carriers built to naval rather than merchant standards. Though only 19 were completed before war's end, these ships showed that the Navy had fully embraced the concept. The transformation from skepticism to acceptance reflected a larger shift in American military thinking during World War II. At the war's beginning, professional military officers distrusted civilian interference in strategic decisions. President Roosevelt's order to build escort carriers over Navy objections represented exactly the kind of political meddling that officers feared. Yet Roosevelt had been proven correct. His strategic vision had identified the critical need that professional naval officers had missed. When the war ended in August 1945, the Navy faced the question of what to do with dozens of escort carriers. Most were obsolete before launching, designed for wartime needs that peacetime no longer required. 33 were transferred to other nations under military assistance programs. Many others were scrapped immediately or placed in reserve. A few found peacetime roles as helicopter carriers or training ships. By 1960, every World War II-era escort carrier had been retired or transferred. Not one survived as a museum ship. Their impact endured in different ways. Post-war carrier design incorporated lessons learned from escort carrier operations. The importance of continuous flight operations, the value of numerous small carriers versus few large carriers, the integration of anti-submarine and air superiority missions, all had been proven in escort carrier combat. Modern naval aviation doctrine traced directly to innovations developed on these converted merchantmen. The U-boat threat they had defeated never returned. German submarine construction after World War II focused on coastal defense and intelligence gathering rather than commerce raiding. The Soviet Union built hundreds of submarines during the Cold War, but never attempted the kind of Wolfpack campaign that escort carriers had destroyed in 1943. Anti-submarine warfare remained a critical naval mission, but the combination of helicopters, long-range patrol aircraft, and sophisticated sonar made surface hunting unnecessary. Perhaps the greatest tribute to escort carriers was their own obsolescence. They had been built to meet a specific crisis, the U-boat threat in the Atlantic. They had met that crisis so completely that their mission ceased to exist. No subsequent conflict required the conversion of merchant ships into makeshift carriers. The escort carriers had done their job so well that nothing like them was ever needed again. In the final analysis, escort carriers represented American industrial warfare at its most effective. Simple enough to build quickly, adequate enough to be combat effective, available in sufficient numbers to overwhelm the enemy. The critics who had dismissed them as death traps in 1940 had been judging them by peacetime standards. These converted merchantmen had been designed for war, and in war they had proven devastatingly practical. From 116 operational U-boats in May 1943 to 51 by August 1943, the transformation took 3 months. Escort carriers were not the only factor in this victory. Long-range patrol aircraft, improved radar, code breaking, and aggressive destroyer tactics all contributed, but the converted merchantmen had closed the mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats had been untouchable. They had hunted submarines in areas where land-based aircraft could not reach. They had turned the hunters into prey. History called them essential,